It's a beautiful Sunday morning, and we have Rajesh Kumar on the show. Welcome, Rajesh.
Hi, Sneha. It is a Sunday morning, and thankfully, it's quite silent around here. But Sneha, I'm having my tea, so you don't mind, right? We'll do the
I
let me do.
obviously don't.
Thank you, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Fine, fine, fine. Let's go ahead. Thank you for the show. Thank you for inviting me over. I was really looking forward to it. We have been planning it for quite some time, so let's dig right in.
So, if you want to dig right in, I would want to start with one of your poems.
Oh, you want me to read a poem of mine?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Do you have a preference, or you want me? I can read any poem that I like types.
Um, I would prefer the poem that you read in the meet that we had in our club,
Do you remember which one that was?
the ocean, and I don't remember the title, but I remember the.
Okay, okay. So let me just open that for you. So in 2019, I had published a book, and there are a lot of poems which I like, which is in this book. But the one that you're saying is something that was more recent. So let me just pick it out from a blog. I think you're talking about. I think you remembered you don't fall in love with the sea. So I'll read that one for you. It's not been read before in any forum. So I'll give you a quick background about this poem. So when two people who are close in a relationship for many years, when they start drifting apart, sometimes you really don't have any reason why these driftings happen. But in a mind, and you experience that drifting very slowly, and then over a period of time, a vastness and a vast separation comes into the being. So I have tried to capture this in this poem. Let me read that for you. The poem's titled "You Don't Fall in Love with the Sea." It was her idea to visit the seashore. She rarely asks anything of me. At the break of dawn, we were near the jetty. Not many people around at this time. I looked at her closely as she looked at the waves splashing on the wooden decks. There was smell of dead and drying fish, and barnacles and burnt diesel from the boats. I looked at her for a long while, expecting that she would say something to bridge the divide. Nothing. An hour later, when the crowd of morning walkers started increasing, I asked her, "Shall we go?" A nod from her, and we were back on the road. As I dropped her home, I looked at the house, the street, the gate with the post box, and the hedges and the weeds once more. I knew that if there is a next time, it will be a long time later. You don't fall in love with the sea. There's nothing from these shores that can fill her longings for the oceans. Thank you.
That's so beautiful.
Thank you. Glad you liked it. So that was a poem of mine titled "You Don't Fall in Love with the Sea."
So, what are your thoughts about it? Like,
So, as I explained earlier, a large part of my body of written literature is about relationships and love. I also write about social issues and other things, but in my mind, I segment those writings into larger prose, mostly into articles. But my poems predominantly is about love and loss and separation and such. So this is one of them, and I've always felt that sometimes relationships just come apart without having any, it need not have very clear reasons, and the only way which would I could describe in this poem is when it's filled with silences, and there's no communication to bridge the divide because the silences are so vast and the separation is so certain that there's no point talking about it. So you still enjoy the last moments. You remember the last memory, you create a last memory of it, and then you move on. And sometimes, as I concluded in the poem, it's also because relationships can be very restrictive. So if you're a lake, you would someday want to run into a river. If you're a river, you would want to someday run into the sea. If you're a sea, you want to merge with the ocean. And sometimes a relationship has to go, has to break apart so that uh, the sea can eventually go ahead and merge with the ocean. So that's how I saw that.
Okay, that's an interesting analogy.
Thank you, Sneha. I think you remembered you don't fall in love with the sea. So I'll read that one for you. It's not been read before in any forum. So I'll give you a quick background about this poem. So when two people who are close in a relationship for many years, when they start drifting apart, sometimes you really don't have any reason why these driftings happen. But in a mind, and you experience that drifting very slowly, and then over a period of time, a vastness and a vast separation comes into the being. So I have tried to capture this in this poem. Let me read that for you. The poem's titled "You Don't Fall in Love with the Sea." It was her idea to visit the seashore. She rarely asks anything of me. At the break of dawn, we were near the jetty. Not many people around at this time. I looked at her closely as she looked at the waves splashing on the wooden decks. There was smell of dead and drying fish, and barnacles and burnt diesel from the boats. I looked at her for a long while, expecting that she would say something to bridge the divide. Nothing. An hour later, when the crowd of morning walkers started increasing, I asked her, "Shall we go?" A nod from her, and we were back on the road. As I dropped her home, I looked at the house, the street, the gate with the post box, and the hedges and the weeds once more. I knew that if there is a next time, it will be a long time later. You don't fall in love with the sea. There's nothing from these shores that can fill her longings for the oceans. Thank you.
That's so beautiful.
Thank you. Glad you liked it. So that was a poem of mine titled "You Don't Fall in Love with the Sea."
So, what are your thoughts about it? Like,
So, as I explained earlier, a large part of my body of written literature is about relationships and love. I also write about social issues and other things, but in my mind, I segment those writings into larger prose, mostly into articles. But my poems predominantly is about love and loss and separation and such. So this is one of them, and I've always felt that sometimes relationships just come apart without having it need not have very clear reasons. And the only way which I could describe in this poem is when it's filled with silences, and there's no communication to bridge the divide because the silences are so vast and the separation is so certain that there's no point talking about it. So you still enjoy the last moments. You remember the last memory. You create a last memory of it, and then you move on. And sometimes, as I concluded in the poem, It's also because relationships can be very restrictive. So if you're a lake, you would someday want to run into a river. If you're a river, you would want to someday run into the sea. If you're a sea, you want to merge with the ocean. And sometimes a relationship has to go, has to break apart so that uh, the sea can eventually go ahead and merge with the ocean. So that's how I saw that.
Okay, that's an interesting analogy.
Thank you, Sneha.
I had something in mind, but I forgot.
That's
So,
okay. You can start over again. The next, I hope all these clips are being saved, right? It's good.
yeah, they're being saved.
So think of the next question, then then you click that again. Start with the next question. That's not an issue.
Yeah, I had a question. I basically wanted to ask you this. You've been writing since in your book. The compilation is from 1997 to 2019. So, do you notice any change in the style of your writing through the years?
I have asked this question to myself a lot of times. Mm, I think if you were to read a early 90s poem of mine and a current poem, you would still recognize that it's me who wrote it. However, a couple of things that come into play is I think the over the years I possibly have tried to write, express the same things with lesser number of words. Obviously, my metaphors and imageries have diversified. I think I have also, it's a lot more visible to me now in terms of the things that I write about um, to express my feelings. So it can be the sea, it can be the railroad, it can be the countryside, it can be an angry river. There's a lot of nature driven similes and metaphors that I now see as a part of my body of literature. Um, and of course, the language is also sometimes I think the language, while it's easier, it also refers to a lot of um, complex concepts. Like sometimes it's about quantum physics, sometimes it's about time itself, sometimes it's about multiverses. And I think that happens because these are the things that came into our minds in the last 10, 12 years only. So there's a lot more discussion on these, a lot more things are being told, a lot more content is available around the net, so you get to read a lot more about these, and hence they come back into your poems and writings. So broadly, yes, I'm the same guy, but I think the language would have changed slightly. Content would have more diversified. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
But usually, like art in general, basically people expect drastic improvements through the years. But there is in your writing, there is that signature style. Like you could recognize even when you read like two lines of the poem that it is yours.
Mhm.
So, what do you say about that? Like, do you think there should be a drastic change in the way you write, or
A good
I
question.
think because in even in my poems, I don't have any drastic change in the way I write. It's usually the same. So, what do you say about that?
That's an interesting question, Sneha, and I'm definitely going to ask you to read one of yours after I have responded to this question. So be ready, okay? And I will ask you to read something that you wrote many years ago and something that you wrote more recently. I would love to hear that. But let me answer that question of yours. A change in the poem can be of several
It
types.
gets stuck.
First is the language itself. Okay, so the language, as you acquire a larger vocabulary over the years, the language, the words that you use, the language that you use would change. As you acquire greater experiences in life, the imagery and metaphors, as I said earlier, would change. What you write about, if your life's experiences have been drastic and life changing, then there's a very high probability. And how your mind sees that, sometimes the mind goes through fundamental transformation because of certain adverse set of experiences. So how your mind sees that and reacts to that might change your writing forever. So these are true, but in my apology, let me tell you that I'm 47 years old. I started writing maybe at 10 or 11, uh, and my writings had fairly stabilized by early 90s, by 16, when I was all of 16 or 20. After that, it was, and I have not had any fundamental transformational life changing experiences. My mind doesn't work that way. I always take a step back and look at things that are happening from an observer's point. And then a lot of times, even though I'm in midst of a lot of challenges, I still have that observer's hat and saying, so that's how it is happening. Good. So what happens? It keeps me immune from mm, a lot of mind changing trauma or experiences or such like that. So there's a stability in how I write, but of course the content might have changed a bit as we spoke earlier, and that's the reason. And also, I was a student in English literature, so the language was fairly, and the schooling was also in English medium schools. So the language was always with me. I didn't have to struggle with the language. At times, that struggle with the language in terms of how the words can be put together to best express your meaning or your emotions, that can feel like a transformational set of activity, like a kid writing English in a language which is alien to her, vis-a-vis the kid growing up and over 20-25 years of journey with English, with language. You The language stabilizes, it lends itself to craft. But for me, luckily, the language always was with me. By the time you started reading my earliest published publicly available poems, the language is also with me. Thanks to that, I think you won't see too much of a change. I hope I have answered your question.
Yes, yes.
Now I want to listen to one of your earliest poems, and then a question, and then your latest poem.
Yeah, I need to search for it.
Search for it, no issue.
Yeah, just give me 1 second.
And in the meanwhile, what I will do is I'll just take out something from Neruda. I don't know why I want to read a Neruda today, sometime later. Are you aware of Neruda? Okay, he was a outstanding, uh, I won't say modern day, but contemporary poet. He passed away quite years ago. He was from the 20th century. So we'll read some of that also later. Yeah, are you ready with the poem?
Yeah.
Yeah,
This one I wrote when I was 16 or 17. So, not very early, but that is when I started my poetry.
yeah,
So, this is my very first poem.
yeah.
It's called A Frosty Mine.
A frosty or a flossy.
Frosty
Oh,
Mind.
frosty mind. Yeah, okay.
I had often shed silent tears because you seemed so crystal clear, and my mysterious persona was something to fear, but I could never overcome my mind's barriers. I think the world was too shallow for making me look like I'm so hollow. Told me it's you I had to follow, and it was my pride I had to swallow. I know that I get lost in my deep sea, but that is where I am truly free. And I wouldn't mind if you were just as curious to see, because I'm just in the quest of self-discovery. So now I know that my depths won't come to you. And here is my answer to the world and a curious you. That clearing this frost to get the view is completely your thing to do.
Is completely your.
Thing to do.
Ah, That might be a very difficult relationship you went through, Sneha.
I haven't gone through any relationships.
Okay, so what's the background of that?
Um, I honestly still can't understand why I wrote that. But I think it's basically the feeling that I felt I was a very different person than what the usual crowd is.
Okay, yeah, I get it now. Okay, okay,
And it's also that I get lost in my deep sea. That is basically just, me getting lost in my thoughts.
okay. And who is the you are referring to? The world in general or the people who populate your life?
You is actually anybody who's like, in the world's eyes is perfect.
Okay, and you believe that because you are a little different, you think differently, you are not perfect. Is that when you're writing this poem, you believe something like that? Or you had this fear?
Yeah, something like that.
It's amazing. So now you see how poetry is also a memoir, uh, a keeper of history in its own way. So from the time in which you wrote, whatever, many years ago, you know who you were when you wrote this. And it's a point in time which you have recorded in a very abstract manner, but you would know that. And when I read it, I would also know that. So I think that's one of the things that good art can do. It can be a gatekeeper to history. It can be a index or a bookmark to a time in your life which you might want to revisit later. I'm really happy you could read that and explain that poem. It's really nice. Uh, I think you should read that more often. Sometimes in our shows, I would want to hear it again.
Thank you. But I just it this piece just really confuses me. I don't know how it came out of my head because it's my very first poem.
Is it? It's your first poem?
Um, I think so. The first poem that I remember
Okay, well,
that I wrote.
it's very formidable. It's very formidable. It has a child like, not childish, childlike aggression to it in terms of this is who I am, deal with it. But it also has this level of self awareness and self confidence that it's up to you to figure out if you want to work with me. But this is how I work with myself. So it's a very good, a good start of a great journey. I hope, Sneha. Really good. I liked it.
Thank you. I mean, I wasn't expecting to read one of my poems in my own podcast because it should be all about the poet that I'm
Oh
interviewing,
no,
not
no,
about me.
it's
But
about poems as well. So let's do that. Yeah, go ahead. So what's the next question? Then I'll ask you to read something which you wrote very recently, a little later, maybe after a couple of questions. Is that okay?
yeah, very recently I wrote one yesterday or day before yesterday, but I don't know why I wrote that. I usually get confused when I write my own poems, and it's like I wrote this. So, do you ever feel like that? Do you feel like, okay, how did this come out of my head?
Good. I think over the years you will get a lot more clarity into what the muse does to you and how much it owns you, because typically a poet who writes from an emotional vantage point of view, um, not from, so that predominantly two or three types of poetic thought: one that is constructed in the mind, and the one that comes through the heart but is channelized through the mind so that the language is clear and all. So a lot of times the ones that comes from an emotional point of view, has the emotions as a source. They play in your mind for a long time, and suddenly they just take life. Like they just come out into a couple of lines or words, something, and you're like, oh, matlab, is this something that I created? I mean, did I write it? I felt that. But over the years, I have realized that as you process life's experiences, all these things are getting indexed and sitting in a library which is accessible to your muse. And when you need to make sense of life in a manner in which only a poet can, those lines would jump out little by little, sometimes all at once, and it will get written. The only thing we do later is refine it so that it sounds better for an audience. So that is quite normal. Um, that the words, without your concurrence, active concurrence, without your conscious effort, would still find a way to escape from you and take a life of its own. So you should allow them, you should celebrate them, and you should thank them for ensuring that you're just the instrument or the tool for those words to come out and not necessarily the source or the creator. So that's how poetry is.
Okay. Now I have a question.
Yeah.
Uh, do you recognize a poet by the way they just talk in general? Because the way the words that certain people use are just like so fascinating that they use things like you've used library and just giving us a mental picture as to what exactly you're saying, very articulate. So can you like recognize a poet by just the way they talk?
Uh, so I told you earlier that there are different kinds of poets. So there's a poetic thought that can come in many ways. Visualization. So I my writings are very visual. It means their canvas will be very large. It will be visual in several different dimensions, like external visualization. You'll have forest and trees and river and all. Internally also, the strife, the struggle, the longing, the passion, all that will be visualized. But not necessarily every poet would be so visual. Their poetry might be different. Their poetry might be mental. Their poetry might use a different set of um, methodologies to express the same thing. But broadly, a good poet, when he or she speaks, you would have an idea that there is a universe in there, which from which the poet draws a set of concrete words to express what he or she wants to express. So it can jump from anywhere to anywhere, like just like right now, as you said, ordinary people would not think of indexing, categorizing, available to the muse, rehashing, and all, because that's not how their minds work. So yes, somebody who is capable of writing poetry, you would know them when they start opening them out, because there'll be some bit of eloquence, there'll be some brilliance in terms of the images that they bring, and the world that they show through their words will be a bigger world, brings a larger, it's like a universe in a couple of words. But whether they actually write it or not, whether they bring it to their poetry or whether they even write it or not, is something that's not always a guarantee. You know, sometimes eloquent and brilliant people are not poets. They might have their creativity in something else. So it's not a guarantee.
Okay.
Uh, who's your favorite poet, Sneha? Do you read poetry generally?
I do, but not a lot.
Yeah,
So I it's very hard to find poetry these days. I mean, I couldn't. I went to a book exhibition and I looked for actively looked for poetry, but I
yeah.
couldn't find anything.
Oh, yeah.
I just found like a collection of William Shakespeare's poems.
There is a challenge.
So
There's a challenge with accessing good poetry today because poetry books are not bestsellers. Okay, so they don't sell in millions. So even if you go to an airport, at best you can find a Neruda at best, and then in you might get Faiz Akram Faiz or something like that. Because most of the joints where books are sold today are corporatized and they belong to very big brands. So they display only books that get sold because of the cost of display. And poetry is a very closed circle. Not everybody reads poetry, and because of that, access to books is limited. And because access to poetry books is limited in popular channels where distribution generally gets done and retail gets done, you have lesser number of people picking up those books. So it's a lose-lose situation, You lose either way. So I can understand what you're saying. I hope someday it will change.
So basically, you have poets who put their work out to the world, and there are poets who just keep it to themselves.
Yeah.
So, what's the thought process behind it?
I think it's fairly simple, but luckily there have been poets who kept their works to themselves, and after their death, their works were discovered, and thankfully it was published, and we have access to that. And I am absolutely sure that there are thousands of poets whose works would never ever come into public domain. And the reason is predominantly about their personalities, um, whether they are an introvert or an extrovert. So, there's a very high probability that most poets prefer introversion to extraversion. And if they're introverts, then there's always this fear of public scrutiny and discomfort of being available in public. So, luckily, new age technology, including social media, blogs, and all, they provide us with a level of anonymity which is fairly certain. It means that I can put up my poems under a name which nobody can recognize as mine, and I can publish it and have a set of followers or people reading those. But even then, there's people who would prefer to write and share it with a close group of like-minded friends. So, like in Twin City Poetry Club that both of us are a part of, there are like 100, active poets out of the 1500 plus active members. I mean, not active members, but I think around 30, 35 people would have a blog, and less than 6 or 7 people would have published in a physical form. So, and but all the others are poets, phenomenal poets. They don't even publish their have their blogs because they are a lot more comfortable sharing with among us, because that's their sacred space, that's a safe space, and they like doing it with us, and they don't like doing it outside. So yes, it's a loss for the world, but hey, uh, you know there is this group among which they share. So I think it helps them be happy. So it's just introvertness and extrovertness. Sorry, there was a
Uh, I primarily see myself as an introvert, but for some reason, I don't shy away from posting my poetry out there. So, it's a little confusing thought actually. Basically, I mean, I would want to say it, but I want to say it in a cryptic way. Like, only people who get it will get it. Otherwise, if you don't get poetry, you won't get it. So something like that. So, well, I mean, anybody can do that, right? So put it out there, but don't really only reach out to a certain people.
So you said two things. One is the fear of hanging stuff out there in the public. That is one. Second is the innate need that if you hang it out, it has to be cryptic so that it doesn't reflect you directly, so that they don't judge you. Now, these are very existential and very, let's say, real fears. But I would always recommend, Sneha, that you try to test the limits of your uncomfortable, let me say, you always try to test the limits of your fears and try to overcome them, because like you're doing this podcast, similarly, when you publish it or have a blog or whichever medium that you use, or a podcast, audio poems, or whatever, it reaches out to people who are fairly like minded, and they can add a lot of value to your art over the years, because and they are like the birds of a feather flocking together. So I would strongly recommend. I am myself somebody who's very averse to public scrutiny. I have very limited social media presence, in fact, none. Just have my blog, and I have my group of Twin City Poetry Club poets. But I'm happy I could at least get to that level. Otherwise, I would have you would have never known me. So yeah, so that's why you should try to break those shackles over time.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay, good. What else? So
I'm out of.
are you going to read one of your latest poems?
Uh, this one is a little like, I don't know, content warning, I guess.
Tell me again.
Content warning.
That's okay. I don't think. Matlab, you can say parental guidance or 16 plus or 18 plus. How does that go?
Um, it's nothing like, a child shouldn't read or something, but I mean, a child wouldn't get it.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So this one is called Photograph.
Yeah.
Two dimensions seem like they held your life. It was just but one moment. Lamplight up your youthful face. Contrast it now with the one that is worn out by the rat race. Shadows, the frame cast on the ground, like the lurking age creeping on you now. One more phrase to make it to the finish line. That one phrase, contemplate death, looks just fine. The photograph was your identity. But now your only beauty is in your children. The pain from giving them life. The only resistance from holding that knife. The mortality of your beauty. Yet beauty itself goes on for infinity.
I won't ask who you wrote this about, but I think I've tried to capture entropy, or the consistent decay of life through eternal time, and how the person changes, perspectives change, but something is always constant. That's a that's a very interesting poem, Sneha. Why did you write that?
I don't know. It just popped up, so I wanted to write it. I mean, I was inspired by one of William Shakespeare's poems. I don't have the book right now to read it out,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah,
it talks about how somebody's beauty is worn out by old age, but it is carried on by their children
yeah,
because
yeah, 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 yeah.
of inheritance.
Mm,
So I combined that with my thoughts and put
mm.
it up there.
Uh, Good, good. It's a nice poem. I think you have an inventory of poems that you're supposed to read in one of our next meetups. Okay, so let's try to have one sometime. I think Monday or Tuesday we'll plan something. I think on the holy day. There's a holy. I don't know when it is. Let's see.
I had one more question. What is what is your thought process when you're actually trying to understand a poem? Like, how do you try to understand a poem that is not yours?
Uh, so I think it's a good good question. Let me just read a couple of lines from Pablo Neruda. Neruda is probably the most famous poet of our times. He was from the 20th century, but he continues to be very relevant. And he was a Chilean poet, and we could only read him in translation. But even in translation, the poems are very brilliant because of his amazing gift to lend life to romance and love. through exquisite imagery. So if you were to read it, something like, let's say, I do not love you except because I love you. I go on from loving to not loving you, from waiting to not waiting for you. My heart moves from cold to fire. Now, just an excerpt from one of his poems. Now, when you read this, two things come together. One, you will have to allow a poet to be himself. It means a poet has a right to his style of craft. I cannot extrapolate it and I'll ask it to be akin to or similar to somebody else's. Or so you read a Mary Angelou, you can't say that why does she not write like Neruda, or a Neruda, why does he not write like a Yeats? So you have to allow each poet his or her craft, allow each poet his or her voice, so that acceptance of the importance or the oneness of the poet with his thought and his craft is the first step to establish a respectful relationship with the poet. A lot of times our mind clouds us, our mind forces us to look for something that is not there in a poem, and then we get disenchanted. That's being very unfair to us and to the poet. So the moment you allow it to be what it is, and then the next step is to allow a creative separation between the art and the creator. It means if you know me and you read my poems, you should not my your knowledge of me should not cloud your judgment of my poems. So my knowledge of Pablo Neruda as a diplomat, if it were to cloud my judgment of his poems, I would entirely lose out his poems or lose out Neruda. So the first step, as I said, is allow the poet and the work to be what it is, independent of you. Second is distinctly separate the poet and the poem, and then engage with it. Just like in life, you meet thousands of people in your life, but you choose to engage with few and hold on to some. That's how poetry is. You would read thousands of poets, you read tens of thousands of poems. The ones that talks to you, you engage with them. You explore that poet or that more kind of similar poems and keep some. They will fundamentally transform you. Don't worry about the others. They don't talk to you just like people don't talk to you. And not everybody connects with you, right? So we'll have to understand this from a very real life point of view and just allow it to be what it is. That's my thought on this.
Okay. So, what are your thoughts on Sylvia Plath's works?
Well, she was a landmark, I think, from her times, and I think she continues to remain very relevant even today. Though the current generation, I think your generation, would have less access to her because of probably only I think people who are students in English would have more access to Sylvia Plath. Otherwise, she's not fairly celebrated in this decade. But earlier, let me just take out something from her. But when I was a student of literature, excuse me, when I was a student of literature, it was, matlab, she was somebody who was out of her time. She was a lady poet uh, of the nature that of the kind of writing she used to write was very different. So that was something that we absolutely relished reading her poems and all. And her imagery was very mythological, religious, but very Kafkaesque at some point of time. So we used to absolutely love her poems.
What was the word you used?
Sorry,
What was the word you used?
Kafkaesque. So Franz Kafka was
Okay.
a writer whose genre of writing led to this word. called Kafkaesque. So he wrote about Nazi Germany, and he used to bring in overwhelming darkness and potential life-threatening moments into his everyday life. He could write about absurdly difficult and dark stuff in an easy manner, and to, to tell to tell what is it called, that dictatorship, authoritarianism, what it does to the human condition, what it does to a free soul, all those things he had written. So that entire genre and that feeling today is called, Kafkaesque. So I think Plath had this ability to do something similar in her poems. So I still remember reading one about it. I don't remember the poem now. It was like too many years ago. But let me read something from one of her famous poems, Tulips. So just a small excerpt I'm reading. My body is a pebble to them. They tend it as water. Tends to the pebbles it must run over, smoothing them gently. It's like, who writes like this? Like, my body is a pebble to them. They tend it as water. Tends to the pebbles as water tends to the pebbles it must run over, smoothing them gently. They bring me numbness in their bright needles. They bring me sleep. Now I have lost myself. I'm sick of baggage. My patent leather overnight case like a black pillbox. My husband and child smiling out of the family photo. Their smiles catch onto my skin, little smiling hooks. Like, it's like these are impossible images of somebody who is ailing and looking at life moving out of her and feeling all those feelings. But it's amazing. It's like, so that was Sylvia Plath for you. I hope I have been able to answer that.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rajesh. That was wonderful talking to you. And I would like to know, I and the audience would like to know where to access your work. Uh,
Yeah. Thank you, Sneha. Thank you, really. I hope I could connect with your audience in a manner in which they would be encouraged to explore a lot of poetry and poets. For accessing my works, they can go to worksofrk.com, which is WORKS for works, works of RK, WORKSOFRK.com, and they will get access to my blog there with a lot of poems and some other writings. A set of poems that I might have published earlier are not available on the blog, but someday I'll publish it there. A large body of my work is available there. They can read it there. And those who are interested and in Hyderabad or anywhere in the world can also join the Twin City Poetry Club by searching for us on meetup.com and join us. We plan to do physical events anytime soon now because we have come across and survived the third wave of pandemic. But we've been doing a lot of virtual shows anywhere in the world. We've got people who log in from the US, all shows. We also had people logging in from Portugal. So, absolutely welcome everybody. Be a part of this tribe, and we would love to have you. Thank you, Sneha, for
Thank you.
doing
Thank you
this.
so much. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sneha. It was wonderful.